Welcome to the Data Scientist Podcast with Dr. Stylianos Kampakis. Dr. Kampakis is a data scientist, statistician, and blockchain expert with a mission to educate the public about the wonderful capabilities of technologies like AI, data science, and DLTs. These technologies have the potential to transform the world, the economy, and our lives. However, there is too much misinformation around tech, and so most people are just confused about what is true and what is not. Whether you are a CEO, an entrepreneur, or just an enthusiast, the Data Scientist Podcast helps you separate reality from hype.
Hi everyone, this is Stelios from the Data Scientist, and on this episode I'd like to talk about a very interesting article I read recently on the Pivotal newsletter called The Economics of Data Businesses. This article was written by Abraham Thomas, and it talks about some observations that Abraham has made on data businesses. That is some of the peculiarities of this domain, but also it talks about why data businesses at the same time they can be very attractive, very profitable, but also very difficult to start. So first of all, some definitions. By data businesses, the article refers to businesses that essentially sell data. Okay, so you can be in the business of selling sports data, you can be something like Bloomberg that deals with financial data, or you can sell data about employees, individuals, like Apollo.io and similar software. So this is what a data business does. And the article goes on to discuss about some of the fundamental truths about data businesses, and one is that a data business, in order to be successful, needs to control unique data. Okay, so that's like very, very important. This means that you have to control data that no one else can control. So I remember, for example, when I used to be very active in the area of sports analytics, there was a company back then that was called Opta, and essentially Opta would capture their own data from football games, which means that the data that they had, no one else had. That's very important. And obviously this is connected to another very important point, that data businesses, in order to be successful, they shouldn't have any intermediaries. Like if you're an intermediary in this process, like if you're buying data from another company, then essentially you're a slave to them, right? So there's not much you can do. You need to have and own your own data supply chain, if you can call it this way. Well, we can, because this is what it is. Another very interesting observation is that data businesses have very slow beginnings. So while everyone knows about Bloomberg, for example, which is probably the most prominent example of a successful data business, it can take quite some time for a data business to take off. Okay, first of all, one problem that data businesses face is that they need to reach a certain volume of data until the data they have is useful. So this is what the article calls the minimum viable corpus. So like we have a minimum valuable product, we have a minimum viable corpus. So for example, if I tell you, look, I'm selling data about, publicly traded US stocks, and I have only 10 companies, that's barely interesting, but if I tell you, look, I have every company, that's been traded in the US over the last 10 years, then, that's something. And obviously if you have a data set of every company that ever traded in the US stock market over the last 50 years, that's even better. Okay, but there's this concept of the minimum viable corpus that if you don't have at least a certain amount of data, then your business simply doesn't provide enough value to the end customer. Okay, and this is connected to another point, that growth accelerates over time. So it takes some time to actually achieve this minimum viable corpus, but once you achieve this, then growth can accelerate. And this is partially because in order to collect this data, a company has to set up various processes and operations. And then as these operations, they become more sophisticated, as they get polished, as they add more and more processes, then eventually they reach this point where they experience these nice economies of scale, which allows them to scale very, very fast. And the article gives a very interesting example from a company called ZoomInfo. This is a data business whose core asset is the directory of names, titles, contact information of corporate employees. And There's an interview with the CEO from 2012, and this was the early stages of this business where they were essentially brute forcing things, and they were trying all kinds of stuff in order to extract data, even speaking with people on the phone, trying to get access to all kinds of data, and there was basically lots of manual work involved in this. And then over time they started adding more and more mechanisms to speed this process up. They started doing things such as, for example, if you wanted to sign up to their service, you could get some discounts or get it for free if you also provided some data yourself. And then they would run various data quality checks to validate that the emails are still operational, etc., etc. And then over time, they ended up growing very, very fast, and also not only growing up very fast, but also providing higher quality data. So now they're at a stage where they crawl around 40 million websites daily, okay, which is a much different process from picking up the phone and having to speak to companies, to HR departments, to CEOs, etc. Okay, and this is a very interesting example of how a business can have very humble beginnings in this space, but then accelerate very fast. But it really comes down to establishing all these different processes, the data quality loops, implementing maybe some growth hacks which allow them to get more data from their users in exchange for discounts or something else. And this sounds somewhat complicated because essentially, and maybe not very glamorous, right? Because a data business, data science and AI, they sound very glamorous, but data science and AI need data to work, right? And however, so far what we've been discussing and these ways of getting data, they're not that glamorous, but this is the way the real world works, right? And in the end of the day, this is actually worth it because data businesses, and that's the fifth point of the article, they can be incredibly sticky. So besides Bloomberg, which we already mentioned a few times, there are other businesses which they can be considered data businesses, such as Dun and Bradstreet, which is 180 years old. Also, various entities related to Lloyd's of London, they're essentially data businesses. And the important thing with data businesses is that once they're established, they are there, right? They're super sticky. So again, they're not glamorous, they're not easy to start with, but once they work really, really well, and they're very difficult to compete with. And that being said, the final point of this article is that data businesses, successful data businesses, are rare. But to be honest with you, I don't think that's something that's worth discussing that much, simply because more successful startups are rare. So much like if you want to create a company in any area, you need to find something which provides value. You need to find something which the market will like and will want to pay money for, not just for the sake of it. It's the same with data. Not all data is useful, and even if there's certain domains where data is valuable, is useful, maybe it's not easy to find sources for that data, so maybe it's not easy to create a data business around this. But still, in one way or another, the fact that this article says successful data businesses are rare, I'd say successful startups are rare. Nevertheless, I found this a very interesting breakdown of data businesses. It's an area that's, again, not very glamorous. As a data scientist, as someone who's dedicated his whole career really to data science and AI, I've used data providers many times in the past. I didn't really give it much thought. It's like, okay, how did they collect this data? Obviously, I've been in situations where I had to write my own web crawler and extract data. But again, it was just a one-off. I never gave it much thought. But that being said, it's very interesting to see that data and data science has become so important that a part of this, data businesses, has reached the level of maturity that we can actually read these types of insightful articles that break down this sector and they explain how these businesses operate. So I found this very, very interesting and very illuminating. To be honest with you, I'm even tempted to think of whether it would be worth pursuing a data business myself in the near future. But who knows? Anyway, I hope you found this podcast interesting. Again, this is just a review of this very interesting article I read about the economics of data businesses by Abraham Thomas of the Pivotal newsletter. If you have any questions around data science, AI, blockchain, tokenomics, agent-based modeling, mathematical modeling, whatever, feel free to reach out to me. Make sure to visit my website, thedatascientist.com, and I hope to see you in some other of our podcasts. And why not maybe even join some of our events with the TESSERACT Academy. We organize many online events, but also in person, obviously depending on how COVID goes. So thanks everyone, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to visit thedatascientist.com for more content about data science, AI, and blockchain.